The Battle of the Gullet is one of the most tragic and devastating events in the entire Dance of the Dragons, and on a visual level, House of the Dragon absolutely delivered on that front. The battle is thrilling, emotional, and beautifully shot. Everything about it looks epic. The dragons look cool, Ramin Djawadi's score is as fantastic as always, and Jacaerys Velarion's death is still heartbreaking to watch. Even if you've read Fire and Blood and knew exactly what was coming, seeing Vermax plunge into the black water with his rider still on his back is an incredibly powerful moment. Jacaerys dies with his dragon like a true Targaryen, but also sinks into the ocean like a true Velaryon. It's tragic, poetic, and undeniably spectacular. However, I always knew that the biggest challenge facing the season wouldn't be the spectacle. House of the Dragon, just like Game of Thrones before it, has never struggled to deliver impressive visuals and epic battles. That was never my concern. My concern was always with the writing, and after watching this episode, that concern is still very much alive. As I've been seeing more and more praise for this episode, I found myself thinking about something that George R. R. Martin wrote in his now deleted blog post. When discussing the changes that would need to be done for the adaptation, he argued that simpler is not always better. Sometimes a seemingly small change creates consequences that ripple throughout the rest of the story, weakening character motivations, story themes, and future payoffs. Martin called these changes toxic butterflies, and I think that the Battle of the Gullet contains one of the biggest toxic butterflies we've seen so far. In the show, Jacaerys enters the battle because he wants to win glory for himself and secure a victory for his mother's cause. Rhaenyra opposes the idea, so Jace literally locks her up in her room and flies into the battle anyway. The result is that his death feels largely self-inflicted. He ignores his mother's wishes, acts recklessly, and then he dies trying to play the hero. It's dramatic, but it also makes him look impulsive and foolish, which in my opinion sort of dulls the tragedy of Jacaerys' death. In Fire and Blood, the tragedy is more potent because Jace is fighting for a different reason. In the book, Jace's younger brothers, Aegon and Viserys, are sent across the narrow sea for safety. But on their way there, their ship is attacked by the Triarchy. Aegon escapes on Stormcloud, who dies after carrying him to Dragonstone, but it's Viserys who is captured and taken hostage. As the book tells us, Aegon's younger brother, Prince Viserys, had no way of escaping from the cog. A clever boy, he hid his dragon's egg and changed into ragged, salt-stained clothing, pretending to be no more than a common ship's boy. But one of the real ship's boys betrayed him, and he was made a captive of Sharako Lohar of Lys. This context changes everything, because we see that Jacaerys doesn't enter the battle seeking glory for himself. He enters it trying to save his little brother. Suddenly, his death becomes more tragic because he isn't acting out of pride or recklessness. He's acting out of love and duty for his brother. And the reason why this tragedy is so much more twisted is that he ultimately fails to find Viserys. The book states, "It is said that Jacaerys Velaryon leapt free of his dragon and clung to a piece of smoking wreckage for a few heartbeats, until some crossbowmen on the nearest Myrish ship began loosing quarrels at him. In the confusion of battle, none of the survivors seemed quite certain which ship Prince Viserys had been on. Men on both sides presumed him dead, drowned, burned, or butchered." There's just no question that this version of the story is far more devastating than the one that we got on the show, because the losses are so much greater for the Black faction here. Jacaerys dies trying to save his brother, but he ultimately fails because Viserys is still lost. In a single battle, Rhaenyra loses both her heir and her youngest son, a tragedy so devastating that it's said to have hardened her heart even more so than it was before. The Blacks technically win the Battle of the Gullet, but emotionally, it feels like a catastrophic loss. And the consequences don't stop here either. because the Battle of the Gullet leaves a permanent scar on the young Aegon. The chroniclers tell us that although he had fled and lived, all the joy had gone out of the boy. He would never forgive himself for leaping onto Stormcloud and abandoning his little brother to the enemy. That guilt follows him for the rest of his life, and when he eventually becomes King Aegon III, he is remembered as one of the most depressed and melancholy rulers in Westerosi history. But none of that can happen if Aegon and Viserys are removed from the battle. By excluding them, the show doesn't just change the circumstances of Jacaerys' death, it also weakens the tragedy overall, removing important motivations and stripping away all of the consequences that are supposed to echo throughout the rest of the story. It's exactly the kind of seemingly small change that Martin was talking about when he warned about toxic butterflies. The battle may still look spectacular on the show, but it does so at the expense of meaningful storytelling, and that could become a very serious problem for the story going forward. And Jacaerys' brothers were not the only major omission from the Battle of the Gullet. The Dragonseeds, Alan, Hugh, and Ulf were also missing. On House of the Dragon, the battle features only 3 dragons fighting for the Black faction, but in Fire and Blood, there are 5. As the book describes it, it is one thing to face a dragon, and another to face 5. As Silverwing, Sheepstealer, Seasmoke, and Vermithor descended upon them, the men of the Triarchy felt their courage desert them. Ship after ship burst asunder or was consumed by flames. Screaming men leapt into the sea, shrouded in fire. Tall columns of black smoke rose up from the water. All seemed lost for the Triarchy. All was lost. At first glance, this might seem like a minor change, but it actually isn't. The inclusion of the Dragonseeds at the Gullet serves a very important purpose for the overall story, especially because this is the moment that actually proves that Jacaerys was right. The idea of giving dragons to bastards and commoners would have been deeply controversial and considered to be incredibly dangerous and reckless. But when the Dragonseeds actually arrive and help save the Black Fleet, Jacaerys' gamble pays off. The very people that the nobility would have looked down upon become the heroes of the battle, and in that moment, Jacaerys actually looks like a genius. That's important because the Dragonseeds are arguably Jace's greatest achievement during the dance. Long after he's dead, the battle stands as proof that his vision actually worked. But their presence at the Gullet also serves another purpose as well. It makes their later betrayal even more devastating. There's a lot of stories that introduce characters and immediately make them villains, but Fire and Blood doesn't do that. Hugh Hammer, Ulf White, Adam of Hull, and Nettles first earn their place as heroes in the story. They fight for Rhaenyra, and they risk their lives for the Black cause, and ultimately, their efforts help the Blacks win one of the most important battles of the war. That's what makes the betrayal so effective in the book. You have to remember that the Dragonseeds initiative was only Jacaerys' idea in the book. He promised these people lands, wealth, honors, and knighthoods if they could be bold enough to claim dragons and fight beside the Prince of Dragonstone against the pretender, Aegon II Targaryen, and his treasonous supporters. But after Jace's death, many of these promises are never properly honored. This is important because it adds context and nuance to their later betrayal. Rather than appearing as one-dimensional traitors, the Dragonseeds instead become characters with understandable motivations, even if their actions remain morally questionable. That's what makes their storylines so much more interesting in Fire and Blood. However, when you remove their heroism at the Battle of the Gullet, you also weaken the tragedy of what comes later on, and that just weakens the story overall. And speaking of Dragonseeds, that brings us to another one of George's so-called toxic butterflies, the decision to replace Nettles with RHAENA on the show. Now, I've already made several videos explaining exactly why I think removing Nettles is a big mistake on the show. But after watching this episode, I'm even more concerned than I was before. In Fire and Blood, Nettles becomes the target of RHAENA's paranoia because of the rumors that surround her relationship with Daemon. Encouraged by Mysaria, RHAENA becomes convinced that Nettles has seduced her husband and turned him against her. Her reaction is extreme, irrational, and deeply unjust. In fact, the chroniclers record RHAENA as saying, "Nettles is a common thing, with the stink of sorcery upon her. My prince would never lay with such a low creature. It was with spells that she bound a dragon to her, and she has done the same with my lord husband. Let Lord Mutin take her at table or a bed and strike her head off. Only then shall my prince be freed." Now, the important thing to remember here is that Nettles had done nothing to deserve this kind of reaction. She had fought loyally for RHAENA and had risked her life for the Black Cause. Even the alleged affair between her and Daemon was little more than a rumor. And yet RHAENA believes them as soon as she hears them, and her reaction is to immediately order for Nettles' head. The entire purpose of the storyline is to show how far her paranoia has consumed her, but the show changes that dramatically with this first episode. Not only is RHAENA present at the Battle of the Gullet, but she is also partially responsible for the chain of events that leads to JACAERYS'S death. And because the show is almost certainly not going to adapt a romantic relationship between RHAENA and Daemon, it seems increasingly likely that this tragedy is being positioned as the reason for the future conflict between RHAENA and RHAENA. The problem is that it risks making RHAENA look justified in her murderous paranoia, whereas in the book, her hatred of Nettles is kind of irrational. It's born out of grief, paranoia, and jealousy rather than reason. But if RHAENA is tied to the death of her son, then RHAENA's anger suddenly becomes much easier to understand. Her paranoia no longer feels tragic and self-destructive. It starts to look reasonable and just. And if that happens, then the entire dynamic loses much of what made it so compelling in the first place. Again, the show's version of the storyline is certainly simpler, but in the words of George R.R. Martin, simpler is not always better. But anyway, before I end this video, we need to talk about Alicent and AEMOND's kiss scene, because I genuinely don't understand why the writers felt the need to include this. You know, one of the things that has always separated parent-child incest from the other forms of incest in this world is that it is treated as uniquely vile and abhorrent. The Targaryens may marry siblings, cousins, uncles and nieces, or aunts and nephews, but relationships between parents and children are a different matter entirely. They are simply not tolerated, even in a dynasty like this one that's famous for its incest. I think the best example of this comes from the main series of books, with the character named Craster. Despite living beyond the wall among the free folk, Craster is widely despised for marrying his own daughters. In fact, at one point in A Storm of Swords, Ygritte remarks that Craster's blood is black, and his deeds are even darker. This sentiment is actually echoed by some of the other men in the Night's Watch, like Sam, who ends up saying something similar. The implication of these words, though, is very clear. Even in a world where Targaryen incest exists, parent-child incest is considered something especially abhorrent. And that's why the Alicent and AEMOND scene feels so strange. I understand what the writers are trying to say. AEMOND clearly has an unhealthy fixation on his mother, and that has been present in his character for some time. But I don't think the show needed the scene to communicate that point. Instead, it just comes across as shock value for the sake of shock value. And that's part of a larger issue that I have with House of the Dragon. Time and time again, the show seems willing to sacrifice nuance in favor of more immediate and dramatic storytelling. Characters become more extreme, conflicts become more black and white, and relationships become more sensational. Whether it's simplifying Jace's motivations, removing the Dragonseeds from the Gullet, replacing Nettles with RHAENA, or adding a scene like this one, the pattern is the same, and it's beginning to be difficult to ignore. It brings me back to what George R. Martin was warning about with his toxic butterflies wand. In that blog post, Martin wrote that there are larger and more toxic butterflies to come, especially if House of the Dragon goes ahead with some of the changes being contemplated for seasons 3 and 4. And looking at this episode, I think we're already starting to see what he meant. None of these changes that I've discussed on this video are massive on their own, but together they reveal a much bigger creative direction that the show is clearly moving towards for the rest of this narrative. The complex motivations of these characters are becoming simpler. The moral ambiguity is becoming a lot clearer, and many of the most complex and interesting storylines are being replaced with more straightforward ones. Characters are becoming easier to understand, but they're also less interesting because of it.
I mean, I got a tour through here beforehand, and we were being shown some of the armor and the artifacts of the various Swedish kings, Gustavus Adolphus, and Charles XII, and some of these others. And you look at them and see, what's the verdict of history on these men? Are these heroes? Are they villains? Are they great people, or people that we should despise? I mean, they're fascinating characters because of their very complexity.
Therefore, I actually agree with George R. R. Martin when he says, simpler is not always better. The Battle of the Gullet was no doubt spectacular. The visuals are stunning, and the dragons are incredible. But when I compare what happened on screen to what was written on the page, I can't shake the feeling that something important is being lost in translation. I feel like maybe George R. R. Martin was right. Maybe these really are toxic butterflies. If so, then it makes his words even more foreboding for me, proving, like he said, that this is not his story any longer. That's what I think. What do you think? Do these changes improve the story, or do you prefer the version told in Fire and Blood? Let me know in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more content in the future. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. Peace.